It's my honor to come over here to talk a little bit about embodied intelligence. It's something my lab has been thinking of over the past few months-ish. We generally work with morphing matter. We recently started to think about, the possibility of leveraging morphing materials and mechanism, basically to think about embodied intelligence from our perspective. So embodied intelligence, I'm sure you guys have heard of it under different contexts. Perhaps it means many different things. It's vaguely defined at this moment. So from the context of this talk, we're pretty much talking about some level of programmability or decision-making through a hardware system, especially in our case, through shape-changing and tunable materials and structures. So people argue those systems are useful from different perspectives. You could argue these kind of purely mechanical systems that can do computation or some sort of actuation is good for physical cybersecurity. So the idea is there are certain important locks you can only unlock when you are physically being present. People also articulate those mechanical computers and actuators are useful for robotics, for especially electronic-free robotics, for extreme conditions and unique environment. And we in our lab also try to think about how such mechanical systems can be basically leveraged in sustainable application. For example, robots working in the field be able to harvest the ambient energy, like the sunlight, the wind, the moisture fluctuation from the environment, and automatically conduct some robotic tasks and maybe eventually degrade into the field. So with this in mind, I kind of stitched together a presentation to talk through, again, some of our team's recent reflection in terms of what are the unique sort of applications or unique technical perspectives when we discuss embodied intelligence, again, through the lens of morphing materials and structure. So there are 4 aspects I want to touch upon with a bunch of examples that are from our lab. Let's start with the first one. So embodied intelligence in the context of physics plus algorithm. We design a lot of morphing materials. So when we think about those, we really think about it as material system that carry hidden forces that are usually calculated or predicted based on some computational algorithm. That's why we think morphing materials are physics plus algorithm. So usually you deal with a certain physical morphing mechanism and you think through how do you compute them, model them, and how do you do inverse design by leveraging these kind of physical phenomena. So through the years, we've been looking into different material systems that could leverage this mindset for design and engineering, all the way from chip memory plastic to pneumatic elastomeric system to even clay and even edible gels. And most of the projects share the commonality of physics plus some sort of a computational design behind it. So here are some quick examples. So for example, we once looked into basically the idea of residual stress release inside thermoplastic can be seen as a way to engineer self-folding and self-assembled structure. So essentially, we're using basically FDM printers, fused deposition printing method, to extrude chip memory polymer and lock some residual stress in place while you are printing them. And then later, if you try to basically heat it up, the stress will be released and the filament tends to shrink. So if you print this shrinkable material on top of a non-shrinkable material, you can create an effective bilayer that will bend when you introduce extra heat to it after the printing. So this FEM simulation is basically trying to simulate what's happening, and we then, knowing a bit of the physics, then we know we can do some sort of a bending actuator. We move on to the computational side, try to leverage a origami algorithm to compute the local bending angle needed, the accumulated bending angle needed at each hinge area, so that we can generate a G-code with prescribed residual stress at each local folding area. And we print everything flat, but once you put it in water, heat it up, it can self-fold back into the Stanford bunny shape. And with that, you can start to design all interesting shapes that can self-assemble from a flat piece. A flat piece, when placed on a hot water surface, turn into a boat, or a disc turn into a chair. So this is a little bit inspired by IKEA flat pack furniture to save packaging and shipping space. But once it's on site, it could, you could assemble them. But in this case, it could assemble itself. If you're interested in the computational part of it, so this is a very simple and standard, basically origami flattening algorithm. You simplify a 3D model into finite numbers of flat faces, and you calculate the folding angle needed at each hinge. But here we need to do something different from a traditional origami model. In a sense, we need to compensate the width needed, because it's a smart material. Any material for a bending to happen need a certain width, versus the traditional origami model, because it's based on very thin paper, that width is ignored. So we had to do basically some offset in the algorithm side to take into account the width of each bending region. And the width is actually indeed different, depends on what is the bending angle needed. Anyway, so this eventually gave us a software platform where you can basically input the 3D model, simplify it into like I said, flat faces, and calculate the bending angle, generate the G-code from it, print a flat piece, and then this is showing once you put it in hot water, so the flat piece can self-fold into the bunny shape. So this is based on this very simple bilayer phenomenon. And fundamentally, this is, as I mentioned, is related to the residual stress release of a thermoplastic, and the residual stress was built in during the printing process. So instead of doing bilayer, we can explore a different physical mechanism, which is basically leveraging the local linear shrinkage rate. So in this case, it's not a bilayer anymore. Basically, we print a single layer, but depends on the print speed or the layer thickness, we could embed different residual stress amount at different local area. You can print a disk. Once you heat it up, it morphs into a dome, for example, or a cone. And you can do computation now to make more arbitrary shape. If you're a little bit into computer graphics, you might recognize now we can basically analyze shapes that are non-developable. So origami shapes are a bit easier to handle geometrically speaking because they're developable. So here we are basically developed an algorithm that deal with non-developable shapes such like a human face or a very specific mountain terrain condition. Basically, you input the 3D model, it flattens it and generate all the G-code. And you see the G-code here, the color indicates the stress or the strain level. And we can also simulate how it would morph into 3D. And again, you would print a flat piece, in this case, a flat disk that morph into a face after you give it extra heat. So we had a lot of fun with thermoplastic, and then we moved on to look at some other physical phenomena as well. So this is a representative one that I love a lot. This one look at a physical phenomenon called differential swelling that tuned by the surface pattern. So imagine this is a swellable gel. You put it in water, it just uniformly grows thicker and wider. But now if we introduce basically sub-millimeter scale grooves on one side of the gel, it'll impact the swelling rate and ratio across the thickness. So the side with the groove will end up swell more slowly than the side without the groove. So if now you basically let it swell in a solvent, in this case, a starch gel in water, you will see a flat piece bends up. Essentially what you get is, again, is still a bending actuator like what I showed with the thermoplastic, but the physics going on is very different. So this is a differential swelling, and the previous one is residual stress release. So once we get to know a little bit of the physical phenomenon, then again, we plug it into some computational pipeline. So in this case, we had to develop a pipeline basically to tell us how the grooves are supposed to be distributed, right? So you can see if our end goal is to get a rose flower, we basically produce a flat stamp in this case with groove pattern on it, and then we stamp on a swellable gel to create the surface texture on the gel, and that's what we are showing at the bottom. So basically a flat piece, if we put it in a solvent in this case, it automatically starts to swell and wrap itself up into a rose flower. We also, so this phenomenon is really straightforward and no magic chemistry. You're right, it's a purely structure modulated morphing mechanism, but it's also, on the other hand, powerful because it's applicable, broadly applicable to soft matter that could swell in a solvent per se. It could be, for example, your dumpling, to some extent, your dumpling cover being boiled in pure water. It also could be some sort of elastomer or silicone sheets being swollen in a polar organic solvent. So we showed in a paper that we can even use this to make fun morphing food. So basically, in this case, you can make a grooved flat pasta. When you, they're all flat pack, your IKEA idea save a lot of packaging space for food. But once you started to cook them, they take on different shapes that they're supposed to be paired with different sauce, with different texture. But obviously, this could go beyond, food. If you're into biomedical, for example, you could make basically gel-based robots with this. So I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this mechanism. Again, I said the groove is a really unique feature that tune the morphing behavior. So initially you get a flat piece into water. By the way, the left is experiment, the right is simulation in this video. So you can see it started to bend towards the groove side, and then it gradually reached equilibrium. And actually now if you take it and go flat, now if you take it out of the water, it bends the opposite side. It's a very dynamic phenomenon going on. Interestingly, this, if for a moment, if you ignore the physics, this is geometrically quite relevant to the pattern of the groove. So it turns out the width of the groove, the gap between grooves, and also the thickness of the groove will impact how much it bends. So there's a relationship you can derive experimentally, and then you can do regression, right, to get a sense how basically the curvature will be tunable based on the geometry of the groove. So once we get that, we went into our kind of comfortable zone of doing computational design with it. So we, based on the experiment calculated, we concluded one groove contribute roughly to 12.4 degree of the bending angle. That basically means you get two grooves, you get like 24.8 degree. And you can imagine, I add one groove, I contribute to like a 20 some degree. And then I add another one, I contribute to 48. I added the third one, I contribute to more. So that's how you could potentially design a flat sheet that can curve into any arbitrary shape. But that's tedious. So there, in graphic world, computational graphic world, I do have a laser actually. Yeah, in computational graphic world, you can do this more holistically. So you could basically, given a target shape you want your flat sheet to morph into, you could calculate the scalar field and then automatically derive the locations where you want to introduce the groove. So from that, you could go back to the complicated rose flower case I just mentioned. So if you know your target 3D shape like a rose flower, you could unroll it to get the flat disk. You could then, in parallel, also derive the scalar field then with that, you can map the grooves to the specific location of this flat disk. Then we basically generate a 3D printed mold, which functions as the stamp. We use that to either mold cast or stamp on a flat sheet to get a morphing disk. Basically, that will eventually morph into the rose flower if you put it into a swollen medium. So with that, you can go more complicated with the morphology, right? So I already showed the flower. So the one at the bottom is an interesting gripper. So it was flat at the beginning. You dip it in solvent. You can grab something because it will bend. Once you take it out, like I said, it's a dynamic process. It will reach its own equilibrium and try to recover back to flat. That's the moment you can release whatever you are grabbing. Yeah, so basically you can make a semi-autonomous gripper with just this groove feature. And this can be applicable for a lot of gels. So in this case, we're using PDMS. If you are familiar with microfluidics and some biomedical soft robots, you know PDMS is really basically compatible with the human body. So so this is the fun application we did. So these are dough. So actually semolina flour based dough, and we are doing the stamping on top of the dough. And once you boil them, they can take on different 3D shapes. So this is the morphing pasta example. On the left, these are showing some finite element simulation, and then you are also seeing some real sample of the pasta. We started to, if you ask why pasta, so it's really fun, and it's a very universal phenomenon, right? Flour-based dough-ish food can swell in your kitchen as you boil them. But yeah, if you also do a simple calculation, macaroni pasta, they're like about 67% of the space is used to pack air. So if you make pasta that could basically be packed flat, you can save a lot of packaging space. So we actually brought this to Italy, and we know people in Italy, basically 1% of the green gas emission is generated by consumption of pasta. So we eventually convinced, Barilla, who, the biggest pasta manufacturer, maybe in the world, definitely in Europe, to collaborate on the project. So yeah, it's pretty fun. Okay, so that's some sort of intelligence related to how physics combine with algorithm. I want to share my second point. That is that embodied intelligence can be sort of amplified by combining materials and mechanism. So I want to believe what I just showed are mostly materials. They are passive, right? They're gels, they're thermoplastic. They can do certain things, but they're also quite limited. Some PhDs in my lab, through different kinds of projects, started to bring up the idea that if you can combine smart material with some structural intelligence or mechanisms per se, you could have more programmability and controllability in morphing system. So when I say smart material, temperature, stimuli responsive, it'll bend, it'll shrink, it'll change stiffness. That's about it. But there's no degree freedoms. There's no sophisticated kind of structural programmability into it. So what I just played on this video is a stiffness changing material. So this is, again, a shape memory polymer, but if you introduce, in this case, we had an almost invisible heating wire embedded in, but basically if you heat it up, it becomes really soft, otherwise stiff, and you can, remember its shape, so it automatically recover back to straight if there's no external constraint. So my students started to basically try to combine this smart material into compliant mechanism to do something that's fancier or something that material itself cannot do. So the whole project is about how you could basically make reprogrammable compliant metastructure that has reconfigurability around all 6-degree freedoms. That sounds complicated, but yeah, basically it's a compliant mechanism, but you can selectively think about it, soften or harden certain rod within the compliant mechanism. The ones that get softened basically free that degree freedom. So you can rationally design it to achieve the degree freedoms and reconfigurability you want. And this is the basic design principle. Again, we know how to address the flexure. You can do basically screw algebra to figure out the degree freedom, depends on how you align those rods. Rod, when it's stiff, is a constraint, right? And then we can define which rod is that so-called smart rod that could reconfigure its own stiffness. And then we look at the degree freedom of the entire system as the output. So the idea is when it's stiff, right, you get 1 degree freedom status, but when it's soft and then suddenly it can bend, you increase the degree freedom. And this is one example we showed in that paper. This is completely stiff, both rotation locked, and this is one is up-down rotation unlocked. So you could, the palm can basically push inside, outside, and this is left-right rotation unlocked. So now you can do left and right, but not up and down. And then if all of them unlocked, and now you have full degree freedom. We talk about using this for example, potentially for rehabilitation or some haptic device. And one thing that we ourselves are proud of is we introduced a rational design pipeline, basically like an algorithm that allow us to design systems that have all 6 degree freedom fully reconfigurable. You could ask for what you want. For example, only X translation is flexible, all other locked. This depends on how you, again, arrange the stiffness changing rod versus the other non-stiffness changing rod. The chart is basically showing when you heat it up versus cool it down, you get a drastic force difference for the same structure. So again, the first column shows a device that only has X translation, reconfigurable in terms of its degree freedom. And the second column is Y translation, programmable, et cetera, for all the 6 degree freedom. And this is a video showing a bit of the same concept. So again, X translation now is freed because we heated up the selective wires our algorithm told us to heat up. And then this is a Y translation being freed. It's already a different mode. This is Z translation being freed. This device really doesn't have any functional meaning. We just wanted to show the generalizability of basically the design method. And this is X rotation. So I'm gonna skip the video, but I think you get the idea. So once we understand how to design the degree freedom as we want, we can look at some more specific applications. So again, I've already mentioned, we picture these type of exoskeleton devices can be used, for example, to constrain certain degree freedom, to do like a haptic, virtual kinetic feedback. For example, if I try to turn a doorknob, I can just free that rotationary degree freedom while lock the other ones. And we also picture we can basically, not fully heat up the wire, but heat up the wire partially with the PWM, so that we can use it to do tunable rehabilitation training. And there are perhaps many other applications designers could think of. But I really see this project as a way to think about the combination of materials and mechanism, and it's very mechanical engineer friendly because my students, if they come from engineering background, they love mechanisms. And these are some ongoing work. So we're trying to explore some more complex sort of compliant mechanisms that could even have some computation or logical behaviors built in. So this is just a door latch, but it echoes back to my idea of physical cybersecurity. So for this door latch is purely mechanical, you could, but you need to introduce 3 sequential motions to open it or to unlock it. So in this case, you have to do, like Z translation first, and follow with the A rotation, follow with a Y translation in order to basically unlock it. And this again is designed by this inverse pipeline we introduced in the paper. This is just video to show. Maybe the left one is a little bit more clear. So you can see the hand has to do that 3 sequential motion exclusively in order to basically open the door lock. We were very excited because this is really getting into that logical computation you could do with a compliant mechanism. And if we embed the smart rod, right, we can reprogram the possible logic you need. You know, this time you need to do this sequence to open the door, but next time if we soften a rod, you have to do a different sequence. So that's getting into that magical cyber physical security part of it. We were also thinking, again, this is semi-conceptual, the design is not even mature, but the idea of leveraging this type of reprogrammable compliant mechanism to create multi-modal robot. So this one, you think about the blue one as one groups of flexure that can be softened versus the purple one as the second group. And depends on which group you soften or harden, you could reconfigure this robot either be a walker or be a swimmer. And this is just a simulation. We actually have not been able to implement this with the physical prototype. This is the walking mode, and this is the swimming mode. No idea whether it's gonna work. At least the compliant mechanism part is correct. We are pretty sure. In terms of the swimming or walking, we have a lot of optimization to do. So this is a different example. Again, I'm just stitching project together to make the point that material in combination with mechanism could get us a little bit further than pure material-driven system. So this case, we are having in this case, the smart material component is the shape memory alloy in the form of this coil embedded in this rubber structure that's rendered in white. And the mechanism part is this white frame and also this blue part. So it's basically like a bistable mechanism. So you can see the fabrication process. Basically, we have a 3D printed frame. Then we stretch a very thin membrane, and then we basically fix the stretched membrane into the frame. Because of this elastic energy we introduced into the frame, it is bistable. Basically, if you try to stretch it, it can quickly flip to the other side. But this is purely passive. Then by embedding this shape memory alloy, we could basically, leveraging the shape memory alloy controlled by electricity to quickly flip the side of this bending actuator per se. And this is what is doing. Basically, again, you pump in, you give it a current signal, it quickly flip. If you have played with shape memory alloy, you know it's a little bit notoriously slow and pretty weak. But by combining that into a bistable mechanism, you can actually turn a very slow actuator into a pretty fast and hopefully more practical one for building robots. So, and we're also showing this actuator has pretty good repeatability. In the lab, we tried to run it for more than 500 times, basically circle back and forth. It's still behaving pretty well. And these are some of the robots we were able to build. So this is the amphibian robot. Basically, the body is made of 2 of those bistable actuators. This is the walking mode, and then this is at the bottom. You flip the 2 actuator at the body. You make it into a swimmer, and this very tiny, but it's showing this is walking. This is getting into the water, and once it's in water, it flips its body, and the legs become the wing. Is the wing? Yeah, the wing. And started to basically pedal. And because I mentioned it's very fast, due to the bistable mechanism, you can make a jumping robot with chip memory alloy, I thought is pretty magic. Because again, the actuator itself is very weak and slow. So you could also basically reconfigure the body shape of the robot. So in this case, you could either basically you can turn a walker into a roller. If it has to roll down the hill, they form a ball shape. Otherwise, they can just bend up and down to walk itself. Yeah, that's that. Continue with my third point. So we also, I also think, we discussed this with many colleagues, how far we can push with basically mechanical system. I visited the robotics center and the many robotic lab this morning at Stanford as well. I definitely saw a lot of hard robot. Basically robotic arm driven by motors per se, with a very classic robust design. And ultimately those machines give us the most precise control, right? The amount of torque that's more ideal for heavy duty things. And it's fully controllable in a sense. You can easily plug in machine learning or like sophisticated control policy to control those robots. And mechanical systems or material-driven systems are the opposite. They're slow. They're not precise. They're very weak. Absolutely in the field of soft robots and basically mechanical intelligence. We discuss a lot whether they're a killer app at all for mechanical systems. I think we more or less started to reach the conclusion maybe there's something that can combine both mechanical intelligence and computational intelligence and reach somewhere maybe neither could achieve by itself. This is super experimental, exploratory thoughts. I actually can't really think about very convincing robotic system that shows both very perfectly. But again, here when I see computational intelligence, I mean to those fully programmable robot system. And mechanical intelligence is closer to what I just showed. So the question is, can we combine these two? Not sure, but I'm showing some earlier experimentation, maybe give some hints at least from our perspective. So this is an example talking about the design of mesh robot. Maybe I've seen some mesh robots around. It's by different name, variable geometry, truss robot, right? Or like looped system. But ultimately, yeah, so they made a bunch of truss and they are connected by node. So if we try to make a morphologically really complex mesh robot like this, in this case, we are thinking of basically a pneumatic actuator, pneumatic linear actuator. You have to have lots of separate control units. You have to have a lot of actuator, a lot of wiring. So if you want to independently control basically each beam or each truss per se. So for a lobster robot like this, you need a 67 control modules. So we didn't perhaps want to do that. So we got quite inspired by, actually this is during my visit to Northwestern Robotic Institute. There are some biomechanics people told me, basically, there's like this muscle synergy concept. Multiple muscle groups are supposed to be grouped and kind of work together to achieve tasks more efficiently. So we started to look at this idea and, think maybe there are ways we could also mechanically group the muscle actuator together. So instead of 67 control module, maybe we could just have like much fewer numbers of modules. In this example, just 3 control module, but allow the mesh robot to do equally sophisticated things. So we ended up, doing that. So basically, you can imagine if we need to group them, each node may have to carry multiple air channels. So we developed a optimization algorithm basically to automatically generate the air channel connection to and the basic idea is like this. It's very simple, right? You have 3 groups, for example, represented by different color, and depends on which group you deflate or inflate, you could get quite different actuation behavior. So the design problem indeed is a little bit complex. You have to think about which beam to be grouped with which one you also have to think about the control sequence, right, of all those beams, basically that control policy aspect. Yeah, this is one of the example. Again, that lobster designed by the idea I just mentioned, and we also tried to implement the physical version. And you can see this lobster is only carrying 2 tubes in this case. So basically, this is grouped into, I believe, 2 groups. And I mentioned the design task is kind of complex if you try to do it manually. You have to think about the grouping. Also, each actuator control, how much contraction ratio you want out of each actuator. Also, the control sequence, basically the control policy, which group will be triggered at the same time, things like that. Now, if you want your robot to do multiple kind of tasks, this is getting even more complicated. What if I wanted to turn around while lowering its body? So it becomes kind of a multi-objective design task. Eventually, we decided a simulator and a manual design. Manual design means manually select beams in a software system is not really practical. So we started to get into basically optimization method. This was an earlier version, basically using genetic algorithm to figure out how to do multi-objective optimization. Basically, given all the input design factor, we can figure out how to group the channels and how to control the inflation and deflation. And later, we also explored how to basically use reinforcement learning to handle similar tasks. And recently, we started to also kind of leverage generative algorithm to come up with the robot design as well. Yeah, this is what we had out of the genetic algorithm. Again, the idea of this like 4-leg robot being able to do multiple tasks through the optimization method I showed in the previous page. So it depends on basically the channel grouping and also the control signal. You could let the robot do different things while not changing the grouping, obviously. So this is showing, yeah, walking, rotating, tilting, lowering the body, and things like that. And you can why we are interested in such complicated mesh anyway? I saw many mesh robots much simpler, right? Maybe like a single unit. I know colleagues over the mechanical engineering department at Stanford, they have some really cool robot made of 1 or 2 unit, basically maybe like a 10 truss. But we were interested in hundreds of trusses, partially because we can do it with the algorithm, but also partially because we were interested in understanding how that morphological complexity could bring some unique design spaces. For example, if you think about your entire helmet is a robot, can you possibly morph the shape of the helmet to afford different tasks? Maybe depends on the scenario when you wear it, or different people with different head shape wear the same helmet. Can you morph it to fit the different needs? So this itself is a morphing, right? It's again a multi-objective basically task you can frame it. And this is also at the bottom. We're just showing we could actually build it. So this is the simulation result. When we actually build one, we were tracking basically how precise each node could basically displace and whether that match our simulation or not. But yeah, from a design perspective, you could really start to think about all complex robots or robotic arms, manipulators, even daily products you can build with it. So we are speculating some more complex things, but algorithmically buildable. Hardware-wise, not sure. So this was a proposal we wrote for a hospital, basically like a morphing mesh bed that automatically fit the body shape or automatically adjust the patient's body posture because they get tired being fixed in one pose. You could also imagine if the mesh gets complex enough, you could really physically render different physical objects in a mixed reality environment, or in this case, yeah, basically give people different experiences. Say you are playing a game, you turn into a bird, how that physical mesh can morph. Not only shape is morphing, right? Your center of gravity will be shifted as you are transforming the physical piece you are carrying as well. Okay, so my last point I want to articulate, why embodied intelligence is interesting, what it's good for. So I started with that question. I guess I didn't give an answer, but these are definitely some more tinkering side of it. My lab was also very interested in looking at basically how purely ambient energy powered system could play a role in the field. Imagine field robot deployed massively in a distributed fashion and eventually degrade into the field. And this could be convincing why you do not want electronics to be part of it, why you want really cheap things to be made, why you maybe want minimum intelligence, but be able to basically execute the task as it's intended to. So we started to play with this concept called ecological physical AI or ecological morphing matter. So the idea, again, so they are some sort of a mechanically intelligent robot, but they are powered by the environment. So the environment gives us the energy, whether it's sun or, again, moisture fluctuation or even geothermal energy. And you design a physical system that could smartly harvest those energy, and also maybe some sort of a mechanical computational unit that could take this input signal, process it, make decisions in terms of what you use those energy to do on the actuation side. So that's a framework we started to develop. And this is not published yet, but it represents some of our thoughts behind. So how you perceive the basically natural stimuli as some sort of signal, and how do you build mechanical devices that rationally filter and process those signals, and how you couple that with morphing materials and structure to do useful things. So for example, like a facade piece, like a window basically mounted on the window, could respond to very specific moisture and like a light condition, automatic open and close to tune the light permission on your window, or how a system built to basically harvest energy and do robotic work in the field to manage a garden. This is a lot to digest. I didn't mean to basically let the audience fully digest it, but just visually give you an impression where we are going. So you could use the lens of embodied intelligence to build artificial systems, but also to interpret how some of the natural systems work. So I'm gonna skip this, not getting into details. So here is an example in terms of, again, purely passive, little bit smart, not quite smart things, but play a role in natural condition. So this project is inspired by a seed from nature. It's called erodium. Basically, it has a coiled body that's responsive to moisture. So in this case, basically rain comes, the coil will unwind, and that unwinding generates a rotational motion, and as a result, generate the thrust force downwards to push the tip into the soil. I'll play again. Again, the coil unwind, the whole thing rotate, and then push the tip into the ground, and tip is where the seed indeed is embedded in. So this is also a little bit like your power school. And we basically got inspired and started to try to make a biomimetic version of that. So on the right, this is made in the lab. It's actually the raw material is just wood veneer, white oak or maple wood veneer. But you can now, if you can engineer your own version, you can carry the target seeds you want. So we were very interested in reforestation. So actually right now we're working with the Cal Fire Department and also over the East Coast with the Cornell Forest, try to actually engineer seed carriers for specific tree species. So the idea is that you could carry many of those. Anyway, they're biodegradable. They're made of cheap wood veneers, and drop them onto the ground, carry the target payload. And once rain comes, they self-drill into the ground. drilling into the ground is very helpful to improve the germination of the seeds you are interested in. And this is a video showing basically like an earlier field test we did at Pittsburgh in this one. And again, it's really really early stage test, as you can see, with a really small box, only carry tens of seeds. But we were able to show we can drop them onto the ground and respond to the rain in the afternoon and self-drill into the ground. So through the project, we also got to collaborate with a lot of ecologists, and we learned basically reforestation, again, is still a very big challenge. Because right now people basically have to do seedlings and then they dig holes, so they manually go up to the mountains, put the seedlings in. It's a lot of resources, and it's also very, very dangerous if you have to go to like sharp slopes to do seeding. And trees are much harder to germinate than vegetables. So it makes a lot more sense for us to apply this technology to improve germination of tree seeds. And for the engineering side, we're basically looking into how we could possibly do things better than nature. I'm not sure if you guys noticed the one in natural system has a single tail. So later we started to add more tails, play with the kind of improvement of the torque of the coiled actuator. So there are a lot of basically engineering optimization work going on in the lab right now. And this is part of the result of the field test. Basically, we're showing we got some initial success for outdoor tests. And we also thought about how we could engineer those, not so smart carrier to be a little bit smarter. In this case, by potentially adding sensing component to it and the wireless communication as well. And you can even possibly network them to do things at a little bit of a networked scale. This is an earlier demo to show you could basically equip an antenna to do a wireless communication. The vision is you will be able to monitor some conditions, maybe underground condition, and then send those information back to a drone that flies by later on. So I have this slides. Yeah, we talk about, this could be really helpful for reforestation. We are also discussing with farmers for fertilizer, basically precision agriculture to save fertilizer uses. And one interesting part, if you're into space, so a lot of the earlier study of seed of this kind were sponsored by space agencies because they were also interested in basically environmental friendly, completely like energy free to some extent, electronic free system that can be used to do soil sampling in outer space. Because the system, although the one we developed is harvesting the moisture fluctuation, but the same mechanical principle can be used, for example, to harvest thermal fluctuation, but do the drilling. Only if you change the moisture sensitive actuator into a thermal sensitive material. So yeah, there could be some really cool applications for outer space exploration. That maybe is also a killer app of mechanical computer. So this last example, very short, again, follow the same threads of thoughts, how mechanical computer can be a good use in outdoor. So another team in my lab is basically envisioning a fully automated garden, from seeding to watering to like fertilizing for like extreme weather condition protection, everything done without electricity and purely with mechanical systems. And we see them as robots because they have, they have sensing, they have energy harvesting, they also have actuation. The idea is that you basically build multiple stimuli responsive pump and valve components, all mechanical. The pump is a way to basically harvest ambient energy and turn them into pneumatic energy, basically compressed air. So for example, this video shows how this component is designed to harvest the thermal fluctuation in the air. and accumulate compressed air into a chamber. So basically, it's a thermally responsive pump, right? And the bottom shows a moisture valve. What it means is that when the moisture comes, the pneumatic channel will open up. That's why it's a moisture-sensitive valve. It's done by a very classic mechanical mechanism called kink valve. The idea is that when moisture comes, there's some moisture-sensitive hydrogel get swollen and then basically close the kink valve by literally kink the tube. So that's just two examples, and eventually we are able to construct a library of stimuli-responsive energy harvesting devices and valves. So you could harvest thermal fluctuation, moisture fluctuation. You can also harvest kinetic energy such as wind and hydro, all pipeline them into a compressed air. And you can also design valves that respond to different environmental stimuli as well. So with all those in place, we started to construct pneumatic circuits that take in account of the environmental condition in this case. This is getting very complex. If you're not, I guess, super into pneumatic actuators, this may be even a little bit trickier to read. But example make life easier. So yeah, so what I just showed is basically like a dispenser that automatically get triggered when the weather and the moisture condition in the environment is right. And then after a certain amount of time, a valve will open up to do watering. And then after a certain amount of time, predefined again, fertilizer comes in. And then when you detect the right wind condition and also it's cold enough, a wind blocker will come out to protect the plants. I hope you guys are paying attention to how I'm describing it. There are a lot of if and when and and condition. So basically, there are a lot of like logic being programmed into the hardware system when we think about this kind of like a fully self-regulated plant device per se. Okay, so to wrap up my talk, we discussed over lunch, hey, maybe the future super powerful devices has the kind of hybrid intelligence, both from the machine and also from the material intelligence. Or you can think about it as a system that's hybrid, right? You have the chips, you have the artificial mechanisms, and also you could have biological mechanisms or biological materials, living or dead, being part of it as well. That's the space, the intellectual space my lab is trying to tinkering around at the moment. And yeah, thanks for your attention.
Any questions from the audience?
Yes.
So for the materials, you said you were measuring basically the width length and the groove length and properties like that. Are you considering like the surface area of diffusion to whatever soluble whatever solution you're putting it into?
You're talking about the morphing pasta region.
Yeah, that for example.
Yeah. So when we do finite element analysis on those structure, we basically plug in all those factors. But in a sense, not like an analytical solution. We do numerical simulation, right? We would measure the diffusion ratio, the change in modulus, and just let the numerical simulation does its magic per se. So it will automatically take account. Basically, it actually renders how the water diffuses into it, with or without the groove. In that case, yes, the surface contact area definitely play a really important role. But when we do that very simplified, right, like groove geometry matching to the contributed bending angle per groove, that we did not. But we so I only had half of the story. The whole story is the groove we know play a very dominant role, but not the absolute role. So there are a lot of non-linearity to the morphing as well. So the idea is you do, but the computation is really lightweight if you simplify it into a pure geometrical problem. We kind of do experimental-based data-driven process to understand how basically the groove contribute to the angle. we get a very simplified value, we do the initial guess, we put things into numerical simulation to optimize the groove pattern. Yeah, so there's like a loop, later loop that's based on more precise physics-based simulations.
The geometric properties are dominant enough where a somewhat linear relationship. Like
yes. Yes. Yeah. But if you want very accurate result, you still have to go back to more sophisticated multi-physics model, basically. Yeah, because it is a complex problem, right? It's not only geometrical. The material will swell, as you can imagine. Most of the cases, it gets saggy, it gets like softer. So the modulus changes, as you can imagine, will play a role. The whole thing will get thicker as well. So it's not. The thickness will change the bending stiffness. So yeah, it's way more complex. Yeah. So that's something I feel really often challenging when we deal with morphing materials, because none of them are like a black and white. So, but yeah, if you are doing a gear or like a linkage, everything is so calculatable. But here, everything is so nonlinear. Yeah.
Fascinating talk. It was really, really inspiring to see the work that you've done, especially with like ecology and robotics and where it all fits in. I'm really curious to hear how you see this area of soft robotics being integrated into like future products that people would use in daily life. You see, because we use like lots of really hard hardware. And so I'm just curious what the future is in your mind for that.
Yeah, as you can see, my approach of thinking about how these soft materials being used in products are quite, I want to say, to some extent different from the mainstream soft roboticists. So ours always try to go some semi-niche area, like a cedar or pasta being basically food being robots. All this, at least it's one perspective I see how non-conventional robots get into products, even non-conventional robotic context. But there are some mainstream applications for soft robots as well. We started to see. I even saw Steve showed me earlier. Soft grippers, right, being mounted as an end factor for a more rigid robotic arm, and you can handle much delicate soft objects like a food or jellyfish or whatever. And my student also started to look a little bit into how you can do a little bit more, I guess, intricate soft gripper. So he was working on, he was showing me it's like a soft skin, but you could, a soft skin mounted on a rigid hand, robotic hand, for example. If you don't do anything, it's just rigid. But then you can inflate bubbles and then becomes very compliant. Now you can grab delicate cupcakes or whatever. And then he can also do suction cut. So now you can grab very smooth object. I see this is a little bit relevant to what I said about hybrid intelligence, how you leverage the smart material aspect that tune a lot of physical materiality, but use those to augment some of the more precise controllable machine per se. I feel this could be one possible direction that's productable down the road.
You looked at the trusses, examples of beds and things. Where has that work gone, or where is it going?
It didn't. So far, it haven't gone anywhere because my student basically worked on the sort of the whole concept, the mesh and optimization of the mesh part, and we tried to propose to a local hospital, to do this. The proposal didn't get through, so we haven't got to work on it. We still believe in it. Actually, we are right now at much better position to work on a system like this than 2 years back. And we also discussed, so the student thesis, so the algorithm is not only applicable for this type of specific truss robot. So the algorithm can be generalizable for example, other closed loop graph-based robot designs, such as tensegrity robot. We actually think tensegrity robot is likely more practical than the mesh, because this mesh doesn't have a recovery force to let it recover back to its undeformed state, basically. Yeah, so we likely will go that route, but with those algorithms.
The environmental DNA collection. Yeah. So what was this very useful, interesting technology? What was the particular thing that your solution addressed? What, was it a particular difficulty of like getting quality or separating? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. This is a conceptual image. It's part of basically in the lab. We're right now having an effort to write a vision paper. So some of the diagrams related to like ecological things I just showed is part of the paper, like those things I mentioned. Sorry, I don't know how to. Yeah, like it's part of this bigger framework. Think about how you can make completely biodegradable robotic system, and we've been brainstorming what are the use cases. Environmental DNA just came into the conversation because we were thinking about, the residues left over by animals, plants, or even soil. So we may not need a robot that does very precise navigation or anything, but we can engineer a passive system that hops or roll around, semi-random, but still statistically predictable. So we're thinking this could be just a way for them. Imagine tumbleweed-inspired system, basically rolling around and collect DNA as long as we know roughly which area this robot covers. It's where we are thinking, but no exact project at this moment is going on. Unless you have some good ideas. Yeah, and also this this image is showing the flying machine. So this is something actually one of my students working on. Basically like dandelion and milkweed inspired flyers, also passive. So those you could potentially use it to collect environmental DNAs in the midair, versus the hoppers and the rollers will be on the ground, basically.
So your work has so many different sources for actuation, such as kinetic and chemical reactions, temperature. I'm curious, like, do you have a favorite, or what are some other potential modality of actuation that you will be excited to explore in the future?
At this point, I feel like motor is awesome. and in terms of self-actuators, there's no single ideal one. So each of them has pro and con. Most of them are weak, and it's really has to be application specific. Believe it or not, the wood actuator, the seed carrier, indeed is one of the very stiff one. Because even when it's wet, the coil, the material itself has still about 5 to 10 gigapad. So most of the hydrogel is like a 1 megapad or 10 megapad, like the soft material. So nothing ideal. I think it really depends on the application. So far, I guess things I didn't show, but it's going on in the lab. We through a defense funded project, we are working on biohybrid. So those would be like a real human skeletal muscle. And there's some good property of that being like self-heal, even self-paceable, but obviously super weak and not controllable. And we are also working on, I'm getting also excited about those high voltage fluidic driven actuator. So those, for example, electro like a static force and all those. So those type of actuators are at least electronically controllable. You pump in a voltage, you drive a fluid. And I think it's also getting closer to our vision of hybrid system. But you can still make soft compliant actuators out of, in this case, hydraulic actuations.
Any last questions before we head to SRC happy hours?
I can ask afterwards too.
Yeah.
seems to me there's a lot of challenges in the environment for various species in terms of adapting quickly enough. Because the challenge of one thing, not necessarily going in a place that things can't adapt to, but we're going there very quickly. It seems to me there might be some solutions you could add, like if there's a weak point and like a plant or something where it needs like some sort of help in delivering seeds, or if there's some weak spot in the chain of the development of that species, something like this could provide like. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Imagine you could provide some solution that could allow for a weak spot in just the time that the species can evolve in 100 years.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean,
It might be a good funding idea at some point. I'm not sure it is right now.
yeah. I mean, there for example, seagrasses in California, in North Carolina as well. So they change color because the weather change and they become a little bit less green to tackle, I think, the condition. Lots of plants does that too. I can imagine some sort of color changing variable skin for the plants, maybe to tune that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All those are very interesting contexts. It's very hard for us as non-ecologists to get into any of those. I would say it's like a pretty big learning curve. We are getting a little bit more knowledgeable about, like, I guess, planting trees, but super interested in things in ocean. Haven't got into understanding the problem space too much yet.